Uh, Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining today's Hangout, our top data trends for 2013. I'm your host and moderator, Ellis Booker. I'm the community editor for the Big Data section over at Information Week. I'd like to thank all of our audience for watching us on YouTube. If everything is working properly, you're watching us in near real time. I would also like to thank our event producer, that'd be Paul Civalgio at Backbone Media. For those of you who don't know, Backbone Media is a web design and content marketing company for B2B technology companies. So thank you, Paul. Finally, I would like to remind the audience that you can send questions to our panel throughout the cast using the following hashtag on Twitter. That would be hashtag data hangout. Use hashtag data hangout, and we'll be monitoring your tweets and asking the panel some questions in the last 15 minutes or so of the show. Finally, there will be an archive of this event, which those of you who registered and are watching us now will receive via email. So I'd like to introduce my august panel who were good enough to join me today. We have David Jonker, the Director of Big Data at SAP. Hello, David.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Okay, we have Gregory Piatetsky, the editor of KDNuggets.com. Gregory?
Hello, Ellis.
And finally, we have Nancy Kopp-Hensley, the Director of Big Data Strategy at IBM. Nancy, thank you very much for joining us.
Quite welcome. Happy to be here.
Excellent. These are three terrific panelists, and I'm delighted that they were all available. So I'd like to start it off by asking each of you to spend a few minutes having the floor, telling us what your role is and how you got involved with big data. Let's start with Nancy. Nancy, you have the floor.
First, okay. So I work in product strategy and product marketing as well as product management. Across the products in our big data platform, I'm one of those people who have evolved from the days of data warehousing and expanded into big data. So I generally come from 20+ years in the data management area, whether it's information management, data warehousing, business intelligence, and all of that really, to me, has evolved into what we know as the big data era today.
Great. Next up, we have Gregory. Gregory, can you talk about your background and experience with big data topics?
Yes, hello everybody. So I started as a researcher in artificial intelligence databases when, big data was something like 1,000 megabytes. I worked at the GT Labs and I organized first workshop on knowledge discovery and data. Then this gradually converged with other meetings. It became large conference, and I worked moved from being a researcher, worked as a chief scientist in a number of startups, and for the last 10 years I've been publishing a newsletter on the website KDNuggets, which is quite a popular source of news on analytics and big data, and I've been working as an independent consultant, or now as the term is data scientist.
Very good. And finally, we have David over at SAP. David, your background and experience with big data topics.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm part of SAP, but actually coming from the Sybase side of the house. So SAP acquired Sybase a number of years ago. So I've been in the data management, data warehousing space for quite some time, both in product management and product marketing roles. So across all the databases, including our data warehousing database, Sybase IQ, and now SAP HANA. And in SAP now, I am responsible for our big data message and big data strategy, if you like, across all of our products.
Great. Before we talk about some predictions or some emphasis that you all think might be important next year, I've been reporting at Information Week for a few months now on big data and so forth. And one of the things that I think is interesting is this question of explaining it to, say, non-data scientist senior executives. If that's something that you're hearing out there from your customers, what's your advice? Let's start with David on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, that constant question we get, what is big data, and how do you describe it? Generally, the way I describe it is, big data is a trend in the marketplace where, for those of us who've been in the marketplace for a long time, or in this industry specifically, I mean, big data's been around forever. We've always struggled with big data, right? But what's different now, in my mind, it's more and more enterprises are realizing, hey, there's an opportunity here. They're looking at the internet companies. Those internet companies have had some great success building business models around how you analyze data, and enterprises are saying, hey, how do I tap into that? So first and foremost, it's a trend among the organizations trying to tap into the data they got.
Right. So does SAP have any formal training for non-IT executives at this point, or are you thinking about something like that?
Formal training in terms of like a certificate, or definitely we're out there educating, right? I mean, we're spending a lot of time. I'm relatively new to SAP, but here's the thing I'm learning about SAP. SAP is into a lot of the major enterprises around the world. About 60% of all transactions, are managed on an SAP system, and so they are, we're going in and we're talking to some of the largest enterprises out there, and they're all asking the question, hey, what's this all about, and how do I use it? So there's no formal training or certification, if you like, or anything like that for the business person, but we're definitely out there educating the market.
Nancy, at IBM, same question for you guys. I know that there is the IBM University, Data University.
Right, the Data University. Yep.
Right. So talk a little bit about how you're, if you will, educating the market, which is so white hot about this topic right now.
Well, I think some of you have probably seen some of our C studies that we did. We did the first one about big data recently with Oxford University. And we interlace a lot of big data across our messaging, even with products. So, for example, at our last product launch, we talked about how do these products fit into a big data platform, and what does that do for you, and try and boil it down to not just the technology, but how people are using it. And I think one of the interesting things about big data is that it really comes down to that it's all data, right? And that the technology now allows us to ingest data into our analytic ecosystems that we couldn't before. So you can give people some everyday examples about what big data is, whether you reference Watson as, one of the first best ways to talk about big data in terms of a machine that played Jeopardy and really was a great example of big data, and what it can do for us now in healthcare and diagnosing disease. I mean, imagine if you had Watson for a doctor instead of your own doctor. You'd probably be better off. So through the work we're doing with Watson, through the C studies that we're doing, through the education in the Big Data University, we were very committed to interlacing the thoughts around big data in almost everything we do.
Mm-hmm. And the question I started off with, which was the non-technical key executive, do you think they're up to speed on these topics, or is there some education that has to happen for them?
I actually think they're more up to speed than we think they are, because there's so much buzz around big data, and there's so many everyday correlations to it that we can point to. And infographics have done a great job of really capitalizing on that. And I turned on the radio in the car the other day, and they were talking about big data with retail, and how some of the online retailers have figured out how to squeeze the extra hour of shipping time by looking at big data. Everyday examples we can relate to. So I think they're better off than they were in the early days of data warehousing, where we really had to sell the value of data warehousing. I don't think we have to sell the value of big data as much.
That's interesting you mentioned hearing it on the radio. I was listening to NPR just today, and one of their commentators said, this is, we've heard about other terms all year, but big data is one that has to be on everybody's radar. So if it's hit NPR, it's out there in the public.
Exactly. This was on a radio station my daughter chose, so.
Oh, okay. So maybe, yeah, a rock station or whatever. So Gregory, how do you see it? Are the executive class understanding both the importance of this? Are they investing against it? And what are you seeing for next year in terms of a commitment to big data?
Yes, well, I think Nancy and David probably talk to executive class more frequently. I think they hear the buzzword. The buzzword has been very hot. I think if you hear it already on NPR, it may mean it is beginning to oversaturate. But the big data phenomenon is definitely real. Look at Google. This is best example of huge successes and potential of big data, or Facebook. All those big social networks, they're possible just because they have large scope and because they utilize big data. So the phenomenon is real, the potential is real. What is new is just the buzzword. And the buzzword is very successful. I think it captures the promise that big data will do things better. And it can do some things better. It can optimize things a little bit, and talk about it shortly. But maybe it will not produce miracles, will not perfectly predict what will happen. But it will do things better than before.
And I know that you've brought some slides with you, which we're going to go to in a moment. I just want to remind the audience who's watching us, we presume, on YouTube, that they can send us questions using the Twitter hashtag #DataHangout. So I'm monitoring that, as is Backbone Media, the event producer. So we hope to hear from the audience for the last 15 minutes for their questions. I've got a bunch of my own, but I do want to get to the audience as well. So Gregory, I know you had some slides. You want to see if we can get that screen share to work, and you can show us?
We'll give it a try. So speaking of data trends, so one trend I can make is we'll continue to see bad predictions. So can you hear my Mayan calendar? Can you see it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, looks like a giant Oreo cookie.
Yes, so I predict that the world will not end in Mayan apocalypse tomorrow, and neither will the predictions of end of the world. People have this built-in tendency to make predictions. Unfortunately, our intuitions don't work very well when data becomes large, and that's why we need kind of real good statistical analysis and data science to make good predictions. By the way, for those who are interested in Mayan calendars, Doug Laney, the Gartner analyst who coined the 3 V's of big data, had a very nice post on Mayan big data and predictive analytics. So, good. So in terms of trends, so big data is definitely growing very fast. IDC had a recent study that showed that from 2005 to 2020, the digital universe will double every 2 years, and will grow to about 50 to 100 gigabytes per person in 2020, or 40,000 exabytes, which is a humongous number. 1 exabyte is 10 to the 18th byte. What is interesting about it is the gap of the untapped data. Now, the same study also estimates that about 23% of the data would be useful if tagged and analyzed, but they estimate that only 3% would be tagged and maybe 0.5% analyzed. So there is a big gap of data that could be useful if it was analyzed, but is not, and partly due to skill shortage. We've all probably read predictions about mythical data scientist shortage of 150,000 of advanced data scientists and maybe 2 million data kind of analytic managers, predictions by McKinsey. So looking at the job site Indeed.com, data scientist demand for data scientists grows at a great clip, and data scientist was pronounced as a sexist job of the 21st century in Harvard Business Review. Not so sure about that. I did.
Well, that's great for you guys, but I'm not in this business, so.
we'll see. But just to put things in perspective, although data scientist jobs grow very fast, but they certainly don't grow as fast as other big data related jobs. For example, demand for Hadoop greatly outstrips demand for data scientists, and partly it's because most analytics professionals are not data scientists. Lots of people who just work on data engineering, data moving, etc. And also, most today data scientist jobs just don't use the title data scientist.
Well, let me stop you there just for a moment, Gregory, which is, and I've done some reporting on this, as has Information Week. Can I ask you, and I'm going to go to the other panelists, if you had to, you were forced to define a data scientist, what are the attributes of that job title? What are we looking for? So let's start briefly with you, and then I'm going to go to David and Nancy.
Well, it's data scientist is a combination of a statistician, a hacker, and an MBA in different proportions.
Okay, David, what do you? How would you define a data scientist? The sexy job of data scientist.
Very similar. I think that's a pretty standard definition, right, that Gregory's giving. The challenge is finding those people, right? And I almost wonder whether talking about the data scientist as an individual is, maybe we need to be talking about data science groups or data science teams, right? Because it's so difficult to find.
Right. Deloitte has made that point recently, that it's not an individual; it's a team effort. Nancy, over at IBM, is there a agreed upon definition for data science?
I don't know about agreed upon, but I think what a lot of us are realizing is that data scientists aren't born, but they're made. And I agree, you can take a really great hacker and help them get a better grounding around the business so that we know what questions we want to ask of the business. Mm-hmm. And then you put those two together, you get a good data scientist. But I think they're going to be very specific to the industries.
Uh-huh. So retail might be different from healthcare, might be different from something
exactly.
else.
Yeah, I would probably disagree with Nancy. I think most of data scientist skill would be transferable. If somebody can work in retail, they can probably do a good job in utilities or maybe healthcare. So I know many people who work quite well across different industries.
Gregory, I think we want to see your face again, so if you could hit your screen share button again.
Let me see. So just, I guess one thing I wanted to, I don't know if you want me to finish with my presentation?
Yeah, just do that one slide and then we're going to move on.
Okay, so just looking at hot areas, mobile data, M2M, machine learning successes on big data. I think that is going to be big. And finally, just warn about big data hype and promises. We see mergers and acquisition, but probably quite a few startup failures. There are, too many prediction startups. So
interesting. So you're predicting startups that are going to bomb out next year?
Yes, because I think the recent IIA webcast, they mentioned there were 315 or so startups that work on big data and analytics, and there's just not enough room for all of them.
That's something I hadn't heard before, and I'm curious, David, what do you make of that notion that there may be too many people running at this problem, and we might see some consolidation next year?
Well, my gut feeling is we'll see a mix of consolidation and more startups as time goes on. I mean, I think I agree. We're in a hot spot, and when you see a hot area, there's a lot of money gets thrown at it, right? So it'll take time, but I think there will be consolidation as the market or the approaches mature and the people, essentially consolidate on certain approaches and then hence certain vendors. But I think, I think that at SAP we're taking very seriously this idea that there's a lot of innovation that can still happen, right? I mean, how do you leverage this information in your organization? And we think that there's a place for enterprises to rethink how they do business, and that's going to take a lot of experimentation, and that'll be a lot of startups, attempting, and a lot of them will burn out. And some of them will stick, and we'll go from there.
Interesting. I was talking to Nancy, one of your colleagues at IBM, a week or so ago, who mentioned that it was her opinion that the data scientists or the team are actually beginning to serve as change agents within companies, that is how strategic the role is. Is that overreaching, or do you think there's something to that?
I don't think it's too overreaching. I definitely think that the buzz around big data has created a higher level of awareness that we've had before in our business, and that the data scientist role has been elevated to something extremely important because, let's face it, analytics is no longer a nice to have. It's critical for a lot of customers to gain that edge. So the person in the critical path to that for them is the data scientist, is to have the ability to have the skills to get the value out of the data. So I don't think it's too far reaching to say that they've elevated.
Great.
Let
me ask some of the questions that I came in with, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. Once again, if you're watching us on YouTube, you can send us a live tweet to the hashtag #DataHangout, and we will monitor that and try and get them to the panelists in the last 15 minutes of the webcast. Question that I'm going to put to David at SAP. David, is there going to be a big data killer app next year? You know, in the early days of computing, it was like the spreadsheet was why people ran out and got a computer. What about big data?
Yeah, great question. Will there be a killer app? I think that there will be, well, let's use the term killer app very loosely, right? I think that, you know, when I take a look at big data, still a lot of the examples that we point to tend to be internet companies, right? And I think that in the marketplace, enterprises are looking and trying to figure out, you know, how do I bring this to Main Street, if you like, think of it in that way, right, from the internet. And at least at SAP, we're seeing a lot of interest across verticals, actually, where companies are looking and saying, you know, how do we create a really interesting customer experience and consumer experience, and having some success there. And I, you know, partly I wonder whether that maybe it's not really an app, but you know, an area, a problem area, if you like, or an opportunity area that or use case. That's going to get a lot of focus. It could be a killer.
Could be a killer. I've got a question now for Nancy over at IBM. So sometimes we hear big data and analytics sort of used interchangeably. Can you help us understand how they're different, or how you can get your mind around the two concepts and keep them separate?
So we're probably guilty of using them interchangeably, but I think the way I would define it is big data, again, is all data. The ability to take advantage of all types of data, semi-structured, structured, whatever structure. And then the big data analytics is the tools and the capabilities that we have to support getting insight from that. So, you know, I see two ways that people are using big data today. One is to enhance existing analytics that they do, whether it's adding sentiment analysis to campaign, streaming in real-time information for fraud, but enhancing what they do today with more information to make their analytics better, or taking a look at what they can do with data that they never had before. So for example, when I worked years ago at McDonald's Corporation, we would have loved to have pulled in all of the T-logs from the cash registers, but we just didn't have the technology to consume all of that data back then. So there are uncharted territories with data that exists within companies that just they could not pull into the analytical ecosystem in the past.
I've heard that argument elsewhere, actually, that the cost of storage, the fact that we can now take telemetry and mobile and social and actually hold on to it, it has been one of the drivers of this. It just wasn't feasible except for, you know, well-funded spooky government agencies a few years ago to do some of those analyses. Gregory, you must get this question from readers, and that is, where do you start? In other words, if you've been reading about this in Forbes or the technology press, where do you, what's a good blueprint for beginning your journey on this?
Well, let me address the question of kind of from the data scientist point of view. I think there is a separate question like where do you start by building a solution that you probably would address some of the big consultant companies like McKinsey or IBM or Deloitte, building big center in analytics. If you want to join kind of the data scientist, then there are lots of very good education areas. I think just this year there are 26 universities in the US that offering courses and degrees in data science. I'm planning to write on that in KDNuggets, and there are quite a few of them are free, like the great courses on Coursera. There are certificates from top places like Stanford, Northwestern in analytics and data science, and lots of tools actually freely available, a lot of very good open source tools. And finally, there are competitions. Look, Kaggle has achieved a lot of notoriety, got a lot of press. Great place to start in data science is by participating in some of the competitions.
Terrific. I want to remind the audience again that they can send their questions to us. We're getting a few in, which is just terrific, at the hashtag Data Hangout, so we can deal with those in a bit. Question for Nancy: is there going to be next year? I think David mentioned kind of use case sort of emphasis. Is there anything you're sort of thinking might bubble up again as a use case, killer app, if you will?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've actually looked at some data on this too. We commissioned a study recently with a research company, and 51% of the customers in implementation were actually using their Hadoop technology for a queryable archive, because the cost to store the data there is very inexpensive. But also, as we create these, and I've heard the term many times now, a Hadoop, where we're bringing in all of this data and we don't quite know what to do with it, but we may want to keep it. I think that the ability to have more data online, but in a less expensive storage, is going to be a very big key use case going forward. Because I mean, at the beginning we talked about how data is exploding. Having sort of a data life cycle management approach is going to be more important than ever. How do we start to age this data? Where do we keep it? Where do we move it? And how do I get back and do trending over time, especially for things like sentiment? So I think that's going to be a big use case.
Something that I've been watching, and I'd like the panel to comment on, is the phenomenon, call it data appliances, that would be sort of locked up, either cloud services or on-premise systems that are sort of tailored to a specific industry or use case. We've seen a few of them. What do we think? Are we going to see more of that next year? Again, as a way of reaching the marketplace that's so hungry for this. David, let's get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, for sure. You know, I think that that we will continue to see more of that. I mean, I think that the smarter organizations anyway are zeroing in on very specific use cases and or very specific problem areas, if you like, and focusing their solutions on that. And that lends itself to the appliance approach, right, or the very focused application stack. But I think the challenge is going to be that over time, really the value is to bring all of it together in some way, right? And current databases don't support that. There's new approaches need to be developed, like more of a data platform than a database. And I don't think that that's an individual appliance. I think that's a different approach. So I think short term you'll see more appliances, but IT data centers are maxed out. I mean, how much more hardware can you ram into those places?
Right. So, Nancy, same question for you. The sort of customized data appliance phenomenon. More of that next year, or?
I think so. I think one of the things that big data has got us to do is to think differently about our architecture. and that we have to be a lot more agile. And appliances allow us to spin off solutions a lot faster than we could before, and to reduce the cost of maintaining them. So I do see that trend continuing, though. I agree we need to continue to reduce the footprint, so density and things like that have to increase on these appliances, which is something we're focused on as well. But I see the trend continuing because I just don't see any business users backing off on the ability to want to get this in their hands faster.
Yeah, and that speed issue is something that I think is kind of interesting, because I've heard, again, anecdotally, I don't recall seeing any quantitative study on this, but the notion that we want our analysis, we have a business problem, a strategic problem, we want to get insights from these data sets, and we want them very quickly. Is there any rule of thumb on how much time people are putting into the creation of some of these models, and before they can get some, actual information out? Gregory, what are you seeing?
Well, the trend that I see is more what's called big data in motion. Not quite real time, but much faster response to big data problems, perhaps complex event processing. I think the days of the unified massive big data warehouse are past. People are able to build kind of smaller, maybe vertical department level or kind of division level units that are able to collect the relevant data and get the responses faster. So whether it's a hardware appliance or some specific software that can do that, I think that's the direction that we're going, kind of more vertical, more domain specific, no more unified data warehouse.
Actually, Gregory just mentioned something that got me thinking about another question, which is, where are these projects located? So, David, are they coming from on high out of the CIO's office, or are we seeing them more in the line of business, IT organization, or maybe not even the IT organization? It's the driver is coming out of marketing or sales. What's SAP seeing?
Yeah, we're seeing both, to be honest. We're seeing the business groups coming and saying, hey, I read this story somewhere. Why aren't we doing this? How do we make this happen? And I've seen the other side, right? The CIO being proactive, saying, hey, we should be doing something around big data, and so I've seen often, for example, they'll go and say, okay, Hadoop is big data, so let's go set up a Hadoop environment. And I think I find from my experience anyway, it's the ones that come with a very specific use case out of the business that tend to have the most success or get to success faster. And it's the ones that start as just hey, we should be doing something, let's start a research project, that tend to flounder because they don't know where to go after they've got the data in there.
Well, research, or is it fair to say goose hunt? Wild goose.
It does sometimes feel that way.
Yeah.
I mean, not that it's a valid approach. I mean, some companies, find their way to success that way, but there are many others that seem to get stalled.
Nancy, what do you think? Is we're hearing two applications, if you will, for big data. One is we have a problem, we sort of kind of understand it, we know the data sets, we're going to create a model, we're going to look into it. The other is we just have a lot of data, ours and somebody else's. Let's put it into some infrastructure and look for insights.
Well, I think what you're starting to talk about is the second use case we see, which is an analytical sandbox, or some people call it a Hadoop. We're
that's great.
Pulling in the data and seeing what we can find. But you need those sandboxes because going back, many of us have been around this industry for a while, but you think about the early days of data mining, where we were just looking for the gold nugget amongst the data. And I believe we're doing the same thing. We're just looking for it in larger amounts of data and different types of structure. And I wanted to comment on the business sponsors because it actually is very interesting to me. I mentioned that we commissioned a research with EMA about this, and they have a great paper that they just published called the Big Data Comes of Age. And there is a section about implementation sponsors, and what's interesting is there's an absolute variety and mix of business sponsors by industry. So you don't see a consistent sponsor. It's across the board, varies by the industry.
That's very interesting.
So
Yeah.
it's really interesting. Unlike the early days of data warehousing, where clearly marketing and finance were the sponsors in many of the early data warehouses, we don't see that same pattern in big data. So it's really interesting.
So if it isn't departmentally driven, does it come down to the individual manager or business leader who just is inclined to be interested in data solutions and data-driven decision making?
Executive sponsorship for big data projects, I think, than there ever was.
Okay. Gregory, you've heard both SAP and IBM just now talk about
I think in the
bunch of
past,
things.
like I said, in the past, we have a lot more.
Sorry, we're having a little lag problem.
Oh no.
Nancy, can you hear me? Gregory?
Yes, I can hear you.
Good.
I'm with you.
We're gonna jump to you for a second. So this notion of where these projects are getting inspired from, what have you seen in your time in reporting on this?
Well, I've seen actually a big variety. I've seen in some cases projects that come directly from CEO, from top management, projects that come from marketing, tend to be more standard, and there are some internet high-tech companies like Google where projects may come from lower levels, like Gmail or other projects came bottom up. But I think for success you cannot have a hot dump. By the way, Nancy, I love your term. You need to have some good sense of what problems you want to solve and how you want to approach it, and then you can start looking for it. So if you just hot dump everything, probably you'll not get too much use from it.
Right.
I agree with that. That is the challenge with that approach for viewers online is, if all you're doing is throwing the data in there, but you don't have a very specific use case, it's very difficult to know what variables to look for, what what value to look for. You really gotta. I mean, maybe it's an interesting experiment to see whether you can set up a head dump environment, but very quickly you need to get to that use case and zero in on it.
Great. People may have noticed that we seem to have lost Nancy from the Hangout. I'm trying to invite her back. These things happen, but we're going to carry on. And
well, another thing, Ellis, if I can add.
Yeah, go ahead, Gregory.
I think that it's an interactive process. Very rarely, if you start with a question and then you do some process of analyzing, then the eventual solution would be answer to exactly the same question. Very frequently, it's an iterative process. You start with a good question, you do some analysis, you find something, maybe have a second refined question, and so on.
I want to
process, not a one shot.
It's right. It's iterative. It's not going to be the number it spits out is an 8 and you're done, right? Okay. I want to go to our hashtag again because we are getting some questions from our audience. This one just showed up. Reminder to the audience: our hashtag for questions is Data Hangout on Twitter. Hashtag Data Hangout. You can send your questions, and we'll start getting to them in just a couple minutes. Here's one that's come in, and it's so good that I'm going to go with it now. Should there be a new kind of visualization tool for examining sandboxes? In other words, he's saying it's difficult to conceptualize some of these big data problems without a visualization front end. David, what do you make of that question from a potential customer, I suppose?
Yeah, fair enough. So yes, I think that there's going to be a need for a lot of different kinds of visualization tools, and but as a quick background from my perspective, the trend towards big data, if you like, part of that to be truly successful, I think organizations need to figure out how to become sort of data-driven, right? How do you create that data-driven culture in your organization? And in my mind, that really means how do you enable data-driven decision-making for all your users, all your stakeholders, right? It's not just the data scientists, it's not the BI analyst, it's not just the decision maker, it's maybe even your frontline worker, and you've got to figure out how you embed it in business processes. And from my perspective, you're actually going to need a plethora of tools actually to make that happen, right? Each user, and depending on the kind of function, they're going to need a different kind of tool. Do the data scientists need some very different kinds of tools that exist out there? Absolutely. But maybe it's similar to how they need to be going about data science. There's going to be some discovery process, right? To figure out what's the right tool to visualize that and understand it.
I see. We're getting some specific questions in as well, so I want to ask some of those.
So Ellis, can I
Gregory, let me
add to this question?
Please,
so
go ahead.
Yes, so thanks for the question. So I think there is a tension between visualization tools, and there are some great new visualization tools. IBM had lots of great research projects. There are companies like Tableau that have great visualization tools. But we cannot rely everything on visualization tools because it requires human to be in the loop and watch everything. So I think there is a need for more automation. For many of the processes, we cannot put human in the loop and have them visualize everything. So visualization tools have their place, but I think most of the work would be really trying to use big data automatically, maybe using machine learning, and not visualize it.
I see. Again, I wanted to move back over to some of our questions on the Twitter channel. Let me just take a look here. Perhaps the biggest big data question for the panel: what percentage of all big data is in actuality 2012 blog posts about big data? So
that's a great one.
Yeah, our waggish audience is asking funny questions. Here's one that actually I think makes a lot of sense, and that is: are there standard models for different common requirements? Sentiment analysis, for example, against social media. Will there come to be an algorithm, a model that company A, company B, company C can use, and as people move between these companies, they can say, oh yes, we used sentiment model 6, and everyone will agree that that's the one they used. And Nancy has come back. So Nancy, did you I'm sorry. Did you get that question about will there be sentiment models that will become sort of, well, models per se, but I gave the example of a sentiment model for social media, that'll become standardized, that people can routinely use and everyone agrees on them, rather than right now it feels like it's customized one-off sort of approaches.
I don't know about agree, but actually at IBM we call these accelerators. So we are looking at horizontal-like solutions, both around log analysis as well as sentiment analysis, that we believe can be horizontally used. So I think we can get there on some of these use cases, like log analysis, machine analysis, sentiment analysis, which the base at least can be universally used across the industry. So I do think we can get there.
Okay. I want to ask both David and David, go ahead.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, it's like going back to data warehousing days, right? I mean, think of all the data warehousing models that exist out there today, and they become standardized. So I think that we'll get there. At SAP, we do something similar to IBM, right? We have rapid deployment solutions, which says, hey, what's a standardized model and what's a standardized architecture, right? Yeah, I think over time there will be models. The challenge, of course, always with, if everyone uses the same standardized model, are you missing out on competitive advantage?
Well,
right?
where's your value add, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Gregory, same question to you. This notion of sort of industry agreed upon standardized models, with the caveat that you might lose some competitive advantage if you use those commodity components. What do you make of that? Is that going to happen?
Well, in some degree. I think within analytical space, there are some algorithms that are becoming recognized as successful. For example, random forest to support vector machines or naive Bayes are frequently used, but each specific algorithm has certain methods that would be, applications would be unique for each case. So you cannot take exactly the same thing and apply it. But what is interesting, I've seen the rise of what has been called analytics marketplaces. There are companies like Alteryx that promote them, and other companies try to do that, and that's a very interesting experiment. Can they build an analytic app? We'll see.
And will it run on my 60-core cell phone that I'll get in 15 years? Let's go back to our Twitter hashtag. Again, that's Data Hangout. We're asking our audience who's watching us on YouTube to provide questions for for our terrific panel today. A couple of people are asking, where do you start? And it's a very open-ended question, of course, driven perhaps by panic. But Nancy, at IBM, what? Let's say we're dealing with an organization that is really unwashed, that just maybe it's using spreadsheets, perhaps. I don't know.
Start there.
Let's start there.
Don't start there.
Don't start there. Okay. But is there any rule of thumb, advice that you can provide for where to start? I think I asked it earlier, but it's been asked a couple of times in the Twitter feed.
Yeah, I think it's very simple. Start with the business, right? And like I said, there's two ways you can go with the business. Can we enhance our existing analytics with some new data points? And a lot of customers start with data that they have already, and then, or analytics that they have already, and enhance that. Like I gave the example of campaign analysis, fraud. Can we get more of a lift with our results by pulling in data that we couldn't before? Or, you know, what business questions can't we answer today that we could if we had some external data? You know, I mean, you look at Facebook, what a great collection of preferences, right? Can we get a better idea of what people are looking for when they go to the movies? You know, the data is there, but start with the business questions. Start with what they need, because if you start with the technology, it's just going to take you longer to get there. We've learned that lesson.
Right. You can go down a very interesting rat hole if you follow just the technology as opposed to the bottom line questions. Here is a question that I've been asking lately, and I'd like everybody to sound off on it. I'll start with Nancy again. And that is there an argument to be made that there are some data sets we really shouldn't be collecting? It's a mistake. It's not contributive. What do you say, Nancy, to that?
I say we don't know yet. I don't think we've done enough to explore all of the data available to us. I mean, how can you with all these zettabytes of data, and we've only really analyzed a few percentage of what's available to us? I don't think we know enough about what we can do to say what we can't do or what we shouldn't do yet.
Okay.
That's going to take some time.
Gregory,
Can I add to that?
Yeah, same question.
So I think there's a big question of privacy. We live so many digital crumbs that it's very difficult to remain private. There have been, for example, competition on Netflix that produced data that was completely anonymized, but still some researchers managed to find out who was some of those anonymized users on Netflix just by looking at the movie ratings on IMDb. So if we think, for example, of healthcare, there is a question, you know, should we collect this data? Because once data is collected, it's very hard for it to stay private.
That's an excellent point. And to David, this contrarian question, are there some things we shouldn't be spending time collecting and storing and analyzing?
So, and I agree with both Gregory and Nancy. You know, to Nancy's point, so you really, I think there's kind of two ways to read the question, right? The one way says, you know, is there some data that's just a waste of time to collect? And I think the answer I agree with Nancy, you know, it's too early to tell. yes, you need to manage the data properly, decide whether, questionable value data, treat it in an appropriate way, right? And figure out how you manage that, so you're not over investing in data that's questionable. But to Gregory's point, there's this whole moral question, and it's interesting, because a lot of the big data talk and conversation in the marketplace tends to be revolving around the technology. But really, for example, let's take that killer use case I talked about where we personalize the user's experience. And we have lots of customers at SAP that are going down that path. Marketing, for example, is often an adopter of big data because there's lots of customer information. Think about following Twitter. There is this, there is a debate that needs to be had, I think, in the industry that says, morally, what should we not be collecting or analyzing, and what does that look like? And I think that kind of conversation is going to get pushed to the forefront sooner or later. Hopefully in 2013, because we need to start having that dialogue, I think, soon, because there's the side to big data that says there needs to be some regulation around how this gets handled, right?
That's a very interesting point, which we've had questions, obviously difference in terms of compliance and privacy legislation from the US to, say, Europe. But you're saying, if I hear you right, David, that big data analytics provide another platform for finding things out that may cause privacy, that may have privacy implications going forward.
Absolutely. And actually, if we have a second just to touch on it a little bit more, I mean, in North America, we have a tendency of, our privacy laws are not as strict in North America as they are in other countries. And Europe in particular is very strict about its privacy laws. And there is a lot of, what Europe would consider violation of privacy laws that happens just as in the normal course of the day in North America. And, so you get these interesting international boundaries, but you do get these interesting questions. We have this idea that if you provide your information to the corporation owns it. North America, maybe that's kind of somewhat standardized. People will assume that. In Europe, that's not the case at all. Right. You own your data, right? And you don't necessarily have a right to do whatever you want with that, even to analyze it or combine it with other data. And it's not well understood.
Right, and Gregory did mention that Netflix example of researchers able to find even anonymized information, but they looked elsewhere and analyzed the two sets and were able to figure out who did what. Are we going to see more of those sort of incidents maybe next year? What do you guys think? Gregory, more of that?
Yes, I think we will, but not sure, what would be the result, because here in the U.S., especially, the attitude toward privacy has been very lax. There is a small group that's very vocal, but the majority really doesn't care. So maybe we'll see more, but maybe nothing will happen in terms of laws or regulations. So we'll.
Let me just ask Nancy, as a like SAP and others, you are a global company. Are you seeing a different attack or approach to big data based on these privacy concerns that David and Gregory have chatted about?
So when we talk about our big data platform, which includes warehousing and our big data or our Hadoop solutions, we always talk about the security and the governance and all of that you need to wrap around it. We kind of came into this gung-ho with just get the data in, and with any data, like before, there's a responsibility, and these systems need to be enterprise ready, and the same sort of security and privacy needs to apply to the big data we're bringing in than to the data that we had before. It's not like it gets a pass because it's big data as opposed to what we already had in our enterprise. So I think coming in 2013, we're really going to see a lot more people thinking about that. And when you think about data warehousing, we didn't want to think about governance and security and privacy and all that until we started to really use the data. And that's what's going to happen with big data as well. When we start to really use it, then you're going to see that really emerge as a big conversation.
Excellent. And the last few minutes, I'd like to ask everybody, we'll go down the line, to make one prediction that they think is going to be important next year relative to either big data, the collection of it, the management of it, the possibly the regulation of it, as we just chatted about, and we will come back to your house next December. We will record this, and we're going to hold you to it. So let's start with David at SAP. David, what's your one prediction?
Yeah, for sure. You know what? At SAP, we really believe that in-memory is a core element to big data solutions moving forward. Not the only element, but a core element. And it's been fascinating actually to see in 2012 the marketplace. The number of vendors that have either announced that they're going to try and do something within memory or have tried to make an offering of some sort to compensate, for example, for Hadoop or whatever. So really, in 2013, we think that any vendor who hasn't offered some sort of in-memory capability is going to do that in 2013, and in-memory will be a core element of any conversation.
Okay, so we have David down on in-memory being big. Gregory, what do you think? What's your prediction?
I think we'll see more successes from big machine learning applied to big data. Like recently, there was a competition on recognizing German traffic signs, and the method using machine learning achieved accuracy like 99.8, better than any human. So I think we'll see that. And a bonus prediction, I think we'll see decline of the big data buzzword, not the trend, but the buzzword. Maybe it will be replaced by smart data.
Okay, very good. And Nancy, you're last up.
So my prediction is that we're going to spend more time in 2013 talking about how to make these systems more consumable and easier. Now that we're starting to grow these big clusters of Hadoop, for example, we're finding that we don't have the same capabilities in terms of system management and the things that we're used to with data warehousing, and that's going to start to become an issue in 2013. And that you'll see the vendors starting to focus more on how do we make this easier, how do we simplify this.
Great place to end, right at the top of the hour. God, it's almost like we planned this. I'd like to thank my three terrific panelists once more. David Jonker, the Director of Big Data at SAP, Gregory Piatetsky, the editor of KDNuggets.com, and Nancy Kopp-Hensley, Director of Big Data Strategy at IBM. Guys, you were terrific. I'd also like to thank again our event producer and host, Backbone Media, for setting this up, and for everyone who sent us questions via Twitter. Thank you so much. Again, all of you who registered will be getting an email with the details on how you can watch this again or watch segments that we're going to get a highlight reel out of. Thanks, everybody, and that is a wrap.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a great holiday.